The haunting melody of a fiddle drifted through the night air as Faith Miller pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the town hall, watching shadows dance across the polished floor. Lamplight spilled from the windows, illuminating patches of the dark street outside, but Faith remained in the darkness, her amber gown blending with the shadows like she belonged there. Silver Creek, Colorado, 1873. The mining town had blossomed in the last 5 years, transforming from a collection of tents and crude cabins to a proper settlement with a main street, church, and even this dance hall where townsfolk gathered every Saturday night. Faith had watched its growth from afar, much as she watched the dancers now with longing and a quiet resignation that some things weren't meant for her. The spring air carried a chill that made her pull her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The music swelled as couples twirled across the floor, women's skirts billowing like colorful clouds, men's boots striking the boards in rhythm. Faith knew she should go home. Her father would be waiting, likely with a bottle emptied beside him, but something kept her rooted to this spot, stealing glimpses of joy that seemed to belong to everyone but her. "Not much of a dance if you're standing out here alone," came a deep voice from her left. Faith startled, pressing deeper into the shadows. She hadn't heard anyone approach. The man stood a few feet away, his tall frame silhouetted against the night. He stepped closer, and the faint light from the dance hall windows caught his features' strong jaw, dark eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners, and a mouth curved into a gentle smile. He wore the practical clothes of a cowboy denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. No gun belt, she noticed, which was unusual for these parts. "I'm not dancing," Faith said, her voice barely audible above the music. "I can see that," he replied, removing his hat and holding it respectfully against his chest. "Name's Kieran Zane, just arrived in town yesterday." Faith nodded but offered nothing in return, hoping he'd take the hint and leave her be. She wasn't accustomed to conversation with strangers, especially handsome ones with kind eyes. "Would you care to tell me your name?" he pressed, undeterred by her silence. "Faith Miller," she answered after a hesitation, "and I should be going." She moved to step around him, but his words stopped her. "I've been watching you, Miss Miller, standing out here for near an hour while everyone else is inside enjoying themselves. Seems to me you want to be in there, but something's holding you back." Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment washing over her. "It's not proper to spy on folks, Mr. Zane," he laughed softly. "Wasn't spying, just observing. There's a difference." "And what would that difference be?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of her question. "Spying's done with ill intent. Observing is what I do notice things others might miss." He gestured toward the dance hall. "Like how you tap your foot to the music or how your eyes follow the dancers with such longing it's almost painful to watch." Faith swallowed hard. Was she so transparent that a stranger could read her so easily? "You don't know anything about me." "That's true," he conceded, "but I'd like to." Starting with why a beautiful woman stands alone in the shadows instead of dancing. "I don't dance," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Everyone can dance," Kieran replied. "Some just haven't found the right partner yet." He extended his hand toward her, palm up in invitation. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Miller?" Faith stared at his outstretched hand. Inside the hall, the fiddle player struck up a new tune slower than the previous one. Couples drew closer together, moving in gentle circles across the floor. "I can't go in there," she whispered. "Why not?" A dozen reasons rushed to her lips: her faded dress, her lack of proper dancing shoes, the whispers that would follow her entrance. The daughter of the town drunk. The girl whose mother had abandoned them both years ago, running off with a traveling salesman, leaving nothing but scandal in her wake. Instead of answering, Faith shook her head. "You should find someone else to dance with, Mr. Zane. There are plenty of suitable ladies inside." "I'm not looking for suitable," he said, his hand still extended. "I'm looking for you to take my hand and give me a chance to prove that sometimes stepping out of the shadows is worth the risk." Something in his steady gaze made Faith's heart flutter. Perhaps it was the sincerity in his eyes or the way he stood there patiently, waiting for her decision without pushing. Whatever it was, she found herself reaching out, her fingers trembling slightly as they connected with his. His hand was warm and calloused, speaking of honest work and hard days under the sun. He smiled, and Faith felt something unlock inside her chest, a small, cautious hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "We don't have to go inside," Kieran said, seeming to understand her unspoken fear. "The music carries well enough out here." He pulled her gently away from the wall into a small clearing beside the dance hall where moonlight spilled through the branches of a cottonwood tree. Placing his hat on a nearby fence post, he turned to her and bowed slightly, one hand behind his back, the other still holding hers. "May I have this dance, Miss Miller?" Faith hesitated only a moment before nodding. "You may, Mr. Zane." He placed his hand respectfully at her waist, maintaining a proper distance between them as they began to move to the music. Faith was stiff at first, afraid of stepping on his toes or making a fool of herself, but Kieran led with confidence, guiding her in simple steps that matched the rhythm flowing from the dance hall. "See, you're a natural," he murmured as they turned beneath the cottonwood. Faith felt a smile tug at her lips. "You're just being kind, I'm being honest. There's a difference there too." As they continued to dance, Faith gradually relaxed, allowing herself to enjoy the moment, the music, the moonlight, and the mysterious cowboy who had coaxed her from the shadows. For these few precious minutes, she wasn't Faith Miller with all her burdens and worries. She was just a woman dancing under the stars with a handsome stranger. The song eventually ended and Kieran slowed their movements, though he didn't release her hand. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Miller." "Thank you for asking," Faith replied softly, reluctantly pulling away. Reality began to seep back in, reminding her of who she was and where she belonged. "I really should be going now. May I walk you home?" he asked. Faith shook her head. "That's not necessary. It would be my pleasure." "My father. He doesn't take kindly to strangers," she explained, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears. Kieran studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Another time, perhaps." Faith knew there wouldn't be another time. Men like Kieran Zane didn't linger long with women like her. He was just being polite, a gentleman offering a lonely woman a brief respite from her solitude. Tomorrow he would forget her and move on to someone more fitting for his attention. "Goodbye, Mr. Zane," she said, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "Not goodbye," he corrected with a smile. "Just good night, Miss Miller. I have a feeling our paths will cross again soon." Faith didn't respond, simply turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back as she disappeared into the darkness. Only when she was certain he could no longer see her did she allow herself to touch her waist where his hand had rested, the warmth of his touch lingering like a promise. The Miller cabin sat on the outskirts of town, a small, weathered structure that had seen better days. Faith approached quietly, noting the dark windows and the absence of smoke from the chimney. Perhaps her father had already passed out for the night, which would be a blessing. She pushed open the door, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The interior was dark save for the dying embers in the hearth, casting just enough light for her to make out her father's form slumped in his chair, an empty bottle on the table beside him. Faith moved silently through the room, stoking the fire and adding a small log to provide warmth through the night. Her father stirred, mumbling something incoherent before settling back into his alcohol-induced slumber. Faith watched him for a moment, a familiar mix of love, pity, and resentment washing over her. Thomas Miller had once been a respected carpenter, his skilled hands creating beautiful furniture sought after by folks throughout the territory. But after her mother left, something broke inside him. He found solace in whiskey bottles instead of wood shavings, and their life had crumbled like decaying timber. Faith pulled a thin blanket over her father's shoulders before retreating to her small room at the back of the cabin. As she changed into her nightgown and prepared for bed, her thoughts drifted to Kieran Zane and their dance beneath the cottonwood. For just a moment, She allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could accept an invitation to dance without fear, where she could walk proudly into a room instead of hiding in shadows. It was a foolish dream, she knew, but as she drifted toward sleep, Faith couldn't help but wonder if the cowboy had been right. Perhaps their paths would cross again, and perhaps next time she might find the courage to step fully into the light. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through Faith's window and the distant crow of a rooster. She dressed quickly in a simple blue work dress, pinning her chestnut hair into a practical bun before heading to the main room to prepare breakfast. Her father was already awake, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes bloodshot but clear. "Morning, Faith," he said, his voice gravelly. "Good morning, Father," she replied, moving to the stove to start the coffee. These were the moments she cherished, the brief periods of sobriety when glimpses of the man he used to be shone through. "You got in late last night," he observed, though there was no accusation in his tone. Faith kept her back to him as she worked. "I walked around town for a bit after closing up the mercantile." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had stayed late at Wilcox's general store where she worked 6 days a week, but she'd omitted her time spent watching the dance. Her father wouldn't approve, might even fall into one of his dark moods if he knew she'd been anywhere near what he called sinful revelry. "Going to be a fine day," Thomas commented, looking out the window. "Might do some work on the roof. That leak over your bed isn't going to fix itself." Faith nodded, hope fluttering in her chest. These were the days she lived for when her father showed interest in something beyond the bottom of a bottle. That would be wonderful. "I saved a bit from my wages last month. We could get some proper shingles from Mr. Wilcox." Thomas's face darkened slightly at the mention of money. Pride had been the last thing to leave him, and he still struggled with his daughter being the provider. "I've got some materials set aside," he muttered. Faith brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of cornbread left from the previous day. "Of course," she said softly. "I'll be heading to work soon. Mrs. Jennings brought in some preserves yesterday that would go nicely with supper tonight." Thomas nodded, already retreating into himself. Faith ate quickly, knowing the fragile moment of normalcy was slipping away. By the time she left for work, her father had moved to the porch, staring vacantly toward the distant mountains. The walk to town took 15 minutes, giving Faith time to enjoy the spring morning. Silver Creek was waking up shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, the blacksmith's forge already glowing, cowboys and miners moving between the saloon and the boarding house. Faith kept her eyes downcast as she navigated the main street, avoiding the curious glances and occasional whispers that followed her. 8 years had passed since her mother's departure, but in a small town like Silver Creek, scandal had a long memory. Wilcox's general store sat at the center of town, a large, well-maintained building with a wide porch and large display windows. As Faith approached, she noticed a familiar figure leaning against one of the posts, tall, broad-shouldered, with a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Her steps faltered as Kieran Zane straightened, tipping his hat to her with a smile. "Good morning, Miss Miller." Faith's mouth went dry. In the harsh light of day, she felt exposed, as if everyone passing by could see the memory of their dance written across her face. "Mr. Zane," she managed, giving him a curt nod as she moved toward the store entrance. He fell into step beside her. "I was hoping to find you here. Mr. Wilcox mentioned you worked for him when I stopped by yesterday." Faith's cheeks flushed. "Did he now?" she asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. She could only imagine what else the storekeeper might have shared about her. "He said you're the most reliable employee he's ever had," Kieran continued, either missing or ignoring her discomfort. "Said the place would fall apart without you." That brought Faith up short. Old Wilcox had never offered her such praise directly, though he'd raised her wages twice in the 3 years she'd worked for him. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Zane?" she asked, pausing at the store entrance. "Actually, yes," he replied. "I'm setting up a small ranch outside of town, bought the old Carson place. I need supplies, and I thought who better to help me than the most knowledgeable person at the mercantile. Faith studied him, trying to determine if this was merely a pretext. Men had tried similar approaches before, feigning interest in dry goods when their intentions were far less honorable. But Kieran's expression remained open, his eyes meeting hers without guile. "The Carson place has been abandoned for years," she said. "It'll need a lot of work." Kieran grinned. "That's what they tell me, but I've never been one to shy away from a challenge." The bell above the door jingled as Faith pushed it open. "Very well, Mr. Zane, I'll help you with your list." The interior of the store was cool and dim, shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabric to ammunition. Mr. Wilcox looked up from his ledger at the counter, nodding to Faith before his eyes widened slightly at the sight of Kieran. "Miss Miller, Mr. Zane," he greeted them, adjusting his spectacles. "Fine morning, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Wilcox," Kieran replied. "Miss Miller has kindly agreed to help me gather supplies for the Carson place." Wilcox raised his eyebrows. "You're the one who bought that old wreck. Bold move, young man." "I prefer to think of it as an opportunity," Kieran said. "Land's good, water's plentiful, and the house has solid bones. Nothing a little hard work can't fix." The storekeeper chuckled. "Well, you've got the right assistant. Faith knows this inventory better than I do." He waved them on before returning to his ledger. Faith moved through the store with practiced efficiency, pulling items from shelves as Kieran listed his needs: nails, tools, seed for planting, foodstuffs that would keep. She was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he moved with an easy confidence, the respectful distance he maintained. "You're new to ranching?" she asked as they examined axe handles. Kieran shook his head. "Worked cattle most of my life. Started as a hand on my uncle's spread in Texas, saved enough to buy my own place eventually. Sold it last year after." He paused, something like grief flickering across his features before he continued. "After deciding it was time for a change." Faith sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone in Silver Creek had parts of their past they preferred to keep hidden, herself included. "Why Colorado?" she asked instead. "Plenty of rangeland in Texas from what I hear." Kieran tested the weight of an axe, seemingly considering his answer. "Wanted somewhere different, somewhere I could start fresh where nobody knew me or had expectations of who I should be." He glanced at her. "I suspect you might understand that feeling." The observation hit too close to home, and Faith busied herself with checking items off his list. "You'll need lamp oil," she said, changing the subject, "and matches. The nights get cold here even in summer." They continued through the store, the practical discussion of supplies creating a buffer between them. By the time they reached the counter, Kieran had accumulated a substantial pile of goods. "I'll have it all delivered to your place this afternoon," Mr. Wilcox said, tallying the purchases. "Faith, you can take the wagon out after lunch." Faith looked up in surprise. "Me? Carson Place is a good 5 miles out," Wilcox explained. "Too much for young Roberts to handle alone, and my back's been acting up something fierce." Before Faith could protest, Kieran interjected. "I'd be happy to help load and unload, sir. Save Miss Miller the trouble." "Nonsense," Wilcox said. "Faith is perfectly capable, been handling deliveries for 2 years now." "I wasn't suggesting otherwise," Kieran clarified, looking at Faith. "Just offering an extra pair of hands." Faith felt caught between embarrassment and gratitude. She was indeed capable, but the Carson place was remote, and the delivery would likely take the rest of her workday. Having help would make the task less daunting. "That would be fine," she conceded. "Thank you, Mr. Zane." Kieran smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. "My pleasure, Miss Miller. I'll be back after lunch." As he left the store, tipping his hat to both Faith and Mr. Wilcox, the storekeeper gave Faith a knowing look. "Seems like a decent sort," he commented, adjusting his spectacles. "Not like some of the riffraff that passes through." "I wouldn't know," Faith replied, moving to organize a display of canned goods. Wilcox chuckled. "Been in this business 30 years, Faith. I can read people like books. That young man's got honest eyes." He paused, his voice softening. And he seems mighty interested in more than just axe handles and nails. Faith kept her back to him, unwilling to let him see the flush creeping up her neck. He's just being polite, Mr. Wilcox. Men like him don't take serious interest in women like me. Women like you, the old man echoed. You mean hardworking, loyal, kind-hearted women who have faced more than their fair share of troubles and come out stronger for it. Faith turned, surprised by the vehemence in his usually placid voice. Wilcox rarely spoke so directly, especially about personal matters. You've got a narrow view of your own worth, Faith Miller, he continued. Don't let other people's gossip and your father's troubles define you. You're more than that, and any man with sense would see it. Before Faith could respond, the bell above the door jingled as customers entered, ending the uncomfortable conversation. She retreated to the storeroom, Wilcox's words echoing in her mind as she arranged stock and checked inventory. Was it possible the storekeeper was right? Had she allowed the town's judgment and her family's circumstances to convince her she deserved nothing better? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing a single step could lead to either flight or a devastating fall. By the time noon arrived, Faith had pushed such dangerous thoughts aside. She had a delivery to make and a job to do. Kieran Zane was just a customer, and whatever had happened beneath the cottonwood tree was nothing more than a moment of kindness from a stranger, one that could not, be repeated. The spring sun hung high in the sky as Faith secured the last crate in the delivery wagon. Young Timothy Roberts, Mr. Wilcox's 14-year-old helper, had assisted with loading the heavier items, but the task had still taken the better part of an hour. Need help with anything else, Miss Faith? Timothy asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Faith smiled at the gangly boy. No, thank you, Timothy. You've been a great help. Tell Mr. Wilcox I'm ready to leave. As Timothy disappeared into the store, Faith checked the harness on the sturdy draft horse that would pull the wagon. Samson was an old, reliable animal who knew the delivery routes well, though they rarely ventured as far as the Carson place. Ready for a journey, old fellow, she murmured, patting his broad neck. Talking to horses now, Miss Miller, came Kieran's voice from behind her. They make better conversationalists than most people, I find. Faith turned to see him approaching, leading a handsome chestnut gelding. He'd changed into fresh clothes, a clean white shirt under his leather vest, dark pants tucked into well-worn boots. His gun belt was visible now, a practical necessity for anyone traveling the open country. Samson and I understand each other, Faith replied, surprising herself with the easy response. Something about Kieran's presence seemed to loosen the tight control she kept on her words and emotions. A valuable relationship, he agreed, tying his horse to the back of the wagon. Shall we? Faith hesitated. You don't have to come along, Mr. Zane. I can manage the delivery. I've no doubt you can, he said, offering his hand to help her onto the driver's seat. But I'd welcome the company, and it seems only right I help with my own supplies. After a moment's consideration, Faith accepted his assistance, settling onto the wooden seat as he climbed up beside her. The bench wasn't wide, and she was acutely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of soap mingling with leather and the outdoors. Besides, Kieran added as Faith took up the reins, you know the area. I'm still learning my way around. Consider it a guided tour. With a slight nod, Faith clicked her tongue, and Samson moved forward, pulling the loaded wagon down Silver Creek's Main Street. They drew curious glances from townspeople Faith Miller, who kept to herself, traveling with the handsome newcomer. She could almost hear the whispers that would circulate by evening. As they left the town behind, the road narrowed, winding through stands of aspen and pine that climbed the foothills. The Carson place lay to the northeast, in a secluded valley that offered good grazing and protection from the worst of the mountain weather. It's beautiful country, Kieran observed as they traveled. Different from Texas, more dramatic. The winters are harsh, Faith warned. Many newcomers aren't prepared for the isolation when the snow comes. Kieran glanced at her. Are you trying to discourage me, Miss Miller? Just stating facts, she replied. Silver Creek has seen plenty of eager settlers arrive in spring only to abandon their claims by the first snowfall. I'm not easily discouraged, he said. And I don't mind isolation. Sometimes it's preferable to the alternative. There was something in his tone, a hint of old pain that made Faith look at him more closely. His profile was strong against the backdrop of mountains and sky, but she noticed a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there before. What brought you to Colorado, really? She asked. It's a long way from Texas. Kieran was quiet for so long that Faith thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were talking to himself. I lost someone, my wife, Eleanor. Fever took her 2 years ago. He kept his eyes on the horizon. After that, the ranch didn't feel like home anymore. Too many memories in every corner. Faith's heart constricted. I'm sorry, she said softly, the words inadequate against such loss. Thank you. Kieran glanced at her, a sad smile touching his lips. It's gotten easier with time, but Texas held too many ghosts. I needed somewhere new, somewhere I could remember her without drowning in grief. Faith understood that feeling all too well, the need to escape painful reminders, to find space to breathe. After her mother left, she'd fantasized about running away, starting fresh in a place where no one whispered behind their hands when she passed. And you? Kieran asked. Have you always lived in Silver Creek? Faith hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her history. But Kieran had offered his pain freely, and somehow it seemed only fair to reciprocate. Since I was 10, she answered. My father was a carpenter in Denver before that. We came here for a fresh start after my mother. She swallowed hard. After she left us for another man, Kieran didn't respond immediately, didn't offer empty platitudes or judgments. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging her loss without diminishing it. How old were you? He finally asked. 12, Faith replied. Old enough to understand, young enough to blame myself. It wasn't your fault, Kieran said with quiet certainty. Faith kept her eyes on the road. In my head I know that, but hearts don't always listen to reason. No, he agreed, they rarely do. They fell into companionable silence as the wagon climbed a gentle slope. At the crest, Faith pulled Samson to a halt, gesturing toward the valley below. There it is, she said, the Carson place. The property sprawled across the valley floor, a weathered 2-story farmhouse, several outbuildings in varying states of disrepair, and a large barn that had fared better than the rest. A creek cut through the western edge of the property, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. Beyond the immediate homestead, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills. Home sweet home, Kieran murmured, taking in the scene. It needs work, Faith observed, noting the sagging porch and missing roof shingles. Kieran chuckled. That's putting it mildly, but the land is what matters. The buildings can be fixed. As they descended into the valley, Faith saw the property through new eyes, not as a dilapidated remnant of someone else's failure, but as a canvas of possibility. Kieran spoke as they approached, pointing out his plans for each area where he'd run cattle, which fields he'd plant, how he'd repair and expand the structures. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Faith found herself offering suggestions which local craftsmen were reliable, where to find the best timber, how to reinforce the barn against winter storms. By the time they reached the house, she was genuinely invested in his vision for the place. The yard was overgrown, wildflowers and grass having reclaimed what had once been a kitchen garden. Kieran jumped down from the wagon, coming around to offer Faith his hand. This time, she took it without hesitation, feeling the strength in his grip as he helped her down. I've been camping in the barn, he explained, leading her toward the house. The roof's more reliable there. Haven't tackled the main house yet. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. Afternoon sunlight streamed through grimy windows, illuminating a large room with a stone fireplace. Despite years of neglect, Faith could see the home it had once been and could be again. It has good bones, she said, echoing his earlier assessment. Kieran smiled. That's what I thought. The previous owners built it well, just didn't maintain it. He ran a hand along the mantelpiece. I've been clearing it room by room. The kitchen's functional now, and I've got one bedroom habitable upstairs. Faith moved to a window, wiping away dust to look out at the valley. It's peaceful here. That it is, Kieran agreed, coming to stand beside her. Though sometimes too quiet, I've gotten used to having people around working cattle. You'll hire hands, Faith asked, eventually. Once I've got the place more established and brought in some stock. He turned to her. For now, it's just me and my thoughts. There was something in the way he looked at her, a warmth and openness that made Faith acutely aware of how close they were standing. She stepped back, uncomfortable with the flutter in her stomach. We should unload the supplies, she said briskly. Kieran nodded, following her back outside. They worked efficiently, transferring crates and barrels from the wagon to the house and barn. Despite his protestations that he could manage alone, Faith insisted on helping, carrying lighter items while he handled the heavier loads. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Faith knew she should start back to town if she wanted to arrive before dark, but she found herself reluctant to leave. Thank you for your help, Kieran said as she checked Samson's harness for the return journey, and for the company. Faith nodded, suddenly shy. You're welcome. Would you? Kieran hesitated, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. Would you consider staying for supper? It's nothing fancy, just beans and bacon, but I make a decent cup of coffee. The invitation caught Faith off guard. She should refuse. It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to dine alone with a man, especially at his home. But they were far from town and prying eyes, and the thought of returning to her father's cabin, to the silence broken only by his drunken mumblings, held little appeal. I really should get back, she said, though without conviction. Of course, Kieran replied, disappointment evident in his voice. Another time, perhaps. Faith looked at him, this kind man who had danced with her in the shadows and shared his pain openly. What harm could there be in one meal, one conversation free from the weight of Silver Creek's judgment? Actually, she said before she could reconsider, supper would be nice, but I can't stay long. The smile that spread across Kieran's face was worth the risk. Excellent, I'll get the fire going. As Kieran unhitched Samson and led him to a corral where he could graze, Faith found herself standing in the yard, watching the lengthening shadows and wondering what she had just agreed to. It was improper, potentially scandalous if anyone discovered it, yet she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. For once in her carefully controlled life, Faith Miller was following her heart rather than the strict rules she'd imposed on herself. And somehow, in the fading light of a Colorado spring evening, that felt like stepping into the light after a lifetime in shadows. The cabin's kitchen was small but tidy, showing signs of Kieran's recent efforts. He'd cleared away years of dust and debris, scrubbed the plank floors, and repaired the large cast iron stove that dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat beneath a window that overlooked the creek. Faith stood awkwardly near the door as Kieran moved about, stoking the fire in the stove and gathering supplies. "Can I help?" she finally asked, uncomfortable being idle. "You could set the table," he suggested, gesturing toward a cabinet. "Plates are in there, nothing fancy, I'm afraid." Faith found mismatched ceramic plates and simple tin cups, arranging them on the table while Kieran prepared their meal. There was something strangely intimate about the domestic scene, the two of them moving around each other in the small space, the smell of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling, the comfortable silence punctuated only by the occasional question or comment. "You cook often?" Faith asked as Kieran expertly flipped the bacon in a heavy skillet. "Had to learn," he replied. "Can't run a ranch on an empty stomach, and hiring a cook for one man seemed excessive." He glanced at her with a smile. "Though I'll admit my repertoire is limited." Eleanor was the real cook in the family. Faith noted how he spoke his late wife's name naturally, without the pained hesitation from earlier. "My mother taught me some basics before she left," she offered. "I've learned the rest through trial and error. My father isn't particular about food, thankfully." "And your father," Kieran said carefully, "he's still in Silver Creek," Faith nodded, focusing on folding napkins. "Yes, he works odd jobs when he can, carpentry mostly, though not as much as he used to." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention the drinking or the slow decline she'd witnessed over the years. But something in Kieran's expression suggested he understood what remained unsaid. "It must be difficult," he said, transferring bacon to a plate, "carrying those responsibilities." The simple acknowledgement, free from pity or judgment, nearly undid her. Faith blinked rapidly, fighting unexpected tears. "We manage," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kieran seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject, asking about Silver Creek's history as he served their simple meal. Faith gratefully followed his lead, telling him about the silver strike that had founded the town, the boom years that followed, and the more stable community that had emerged as the easily accessible ore dwindled. "Most of the mines still operate, but they're owned by Eastern companies now," she explained, enjoying the beans that were surprisingly flavorful with bits of onion and chili. "The town's more diverse than it was: ranchers, merchants, families, not just miners and those who cater to them." "And where do you fit in all that?" Kieran asked, refilling her coffee cup. Faith hesitated. "I'm not sure I do," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just passing through, waiting for something." "What are you waiting for?" It was a simple question, but it struck at the heart of something Faith had never fully articulated, even to herself. What did she want? What future did she envision beyond the narrow existence she'd carved out? "I don't know," she finally said. "Something different, something more." She shook her head, embarrassed by the vagueness of her answer. "That sounds foolish." "Not at all," Kieran replied. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes, like life is happening around them instead of to them." Faith met his gaze across the table, struck by how perfectly he'd captured her feeling. "Yes, exactly that." "Is that why you were watching the dance instead of participating?" he asked. "Because you felt apart from it all?" The question brought Faith back to their first meeting, to the shadows where she'd hidden and the hand he'd extended to draw her into the light. "Partly," she acknowledged, "and partly because—" She paused, uncertain whether to continue. "Because," Kieran prompted gently. "Because people talk," Faith said, the words coming in a rush. "They have opinions about me, about my family, the drunk's daughter, the girl whose mother ran off with a traveling man. They watch and whisper, and it's easier to stay away than to face their judgment." Kieran was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "People will always talk," he finally said. "That's the nature of small towns, but living your life according to their expectations means they win." "It's not that simple," Faith protested. "Isn't it?" Kieran leaned forward. "You're allowing other people's opinions to dictate your choices, to keep you in the shadows when you clearly want to step into the light." Faith felt a flare of indignation. "You don't understand. You're new here. You don't know what it's like to have your every move scrutinized, to have your family's shame follow you like a shadow." "You're right," he conceded. "I don't know your specific experience, but I do know what it's like to have people make assumptions, to be pitied and whispered about." His voice softened. "After Alina died, well-meaning folks treated me like I might shatter at any moment. They tiptoed around me, spoke of her in hushed tones, tried to introduce me to eligible young women before the ground on her grave had settled." Faith's anger dissipated. "I'm sorry." "That must have been difficult." "It was," Kieran agreed. "But I realized something important. Their behavior reflected their discomfort, not mine. Their whispers were about easing their own awkwardness, not about helping me grieve." He reached across the table, his hand coming to rest near hers without touching. "The same is true for you, Faith. Their gossip isn't about you, it's about them, their fears, their insecurities, their need to feel superior." Faith stared at his hand, so close to hers. "Even if that's true, it doesn't make it easier to bear." No, Kieran agreed, but recognizing it might make it easier to ignore. He smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. And finding people who see you really see you helps too. And you think you see me? Faith asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. I'm trying to, he replied simply. If you'll let me. The honesty in his voice made Faith's chest tighten. She wasn't used to such direct conversation, to having her feelings acknowledged and validated. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff with the wind at her back. Before she could respond, she noticed the fading light outside the window. It's getting late, she said, rising from the table. I should go. Mr. Wilcox will be expecting the wagon back. Kieran nodded, though disappointment flickered across his features. Of course. Let me hitch up Samson for you. As they cleared the table together, Faith felt the comfortable atmosphere shift, tension creeping in as reality reasserted itself. She would return to town, to her father, to the life she knew. Kieran would remain here, working on his ranch, their paths perhaps crossing occasionally in town, yet something had changed between them. A connection had formed, fragile but undeniable, like the first green shoot pushing through spring soil. Outside, the sky had deepened to indigo, the first stars appearing as Kieran prepared the wagon. Faith stood nearby, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill, watching his capable movements. Thank you for supper, she said as he finished securing the harness. And for the conversation. Kieran turned to her, his features half shadowed in the twilight. Thank you for staying. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a meal with pleasant company. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hands strong and steady at her waist. As Faith settled the reins in her lap, Kieran remained standing beside the wagon, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Will you be delivering to the Carson place again? He asked. Faith shook her head. Probably not. Mr. Wilcox usually handles the outlying deliveries himself. Then perhaps I'll see you in town, Kieran said, at the Mercantile. Perhaps, Faith agreed, though they both knew casual encounters at the store would be nothing like the hours they'd just shared. Kieran seemed to hesitate, then asked, There's another dance this Saturday. Would you consider attending? With me. The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Faith's immediate instinct was to refuse to retreat to the safety of her carefully controlled existence. But Kieran's words from earlier echoed in her mind. Living your life according to their expectations means they win. I'll think about it, she said, surprising herself with the non-refusal. Kieran smiled, the expression warming his features even in the gathering darkness. That's all I ask. He stepped back from the wagon. Safe journey, Faith. It wasn't until she was halfway back to town, the wagon rumbling along the moonlit road, that Faith realized he'd called her by her given name. The familiar address should have shocked her, should have seemed improper or presumptuous. Instead, it felt right, as natural as the stars appearing in the evening sky. And for the first time in years, Faith Miller allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she'd resigned herself to, a future where she might step out of the shadows and into the light of possibility. The following days passed in a blur of routine for Faith. She rose early, prepared breakfast for her father, worked long hours at the Mercantile, and returned home to cook supper and tend to household chores. Yet beneath this familiar pattern, something had shifted. Thoughts of Kieran Zane and their conversations drifted through her mind at unexpected moments, bringing unbidden smiles to her lips. Her father noticed the change one evening as she hummed while washing dishes, a tune from the dance hall that had lingered in her memory. You seem different, Thomas observed from his chair by the fire. It was one of his better evenings, clear-eyed and present, the whiskey bottle untouched beside him, Faith's hands stilled in the soapy water. Do I? Thomas studied her, his weathered face softening. Happier, maybe. Reminds me of your mother when she was young. Always had a song on her lips. The comparison to her mother might once have stung, but tonight Faith found it oddly touching. Before the bitterness and restlessness had taken hold, Charlotte Miller had been a vibrant woman who filled their home with music and laughter. "Just enjoying the spring weather," Faith replied, resuming her task. Thomas nodded, though his eyes suggested he didn't entirely believe her. "Wilcox mentioned you delivered out to the Carson place, said a newcomer bought it. Texas man." Faith concentrated on scrubbing a stubborn pot, hoping her father wouldn't notice the warmth creeping into her cheeks. "Mr. Zane, he seems industrious, has plans to restore the property." "Carson Place is a money pit," Thomas grunted. "Good land, but those buildings need more work than they're worth." "Mr. Zane is handy," Faith said, then wished she hadn't when her father raised an eyebrow. "Is he now? And how would you know that?" Faith turned away, arranging clean dishes on the shelf. "Just an impression. He knew what supplies he needed, spoke knowledgeably about repairs." Thomas was quiet for so long that Faith thought the conversation had ended. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "You're 20 years old, Faith, old enough to make your own judgments about people." He stared into the fire. "I haven't been the father you deserved, haven't been much of anything since your mother left, but I've eyes enough to see you withering here, living half a life because of my failures." Faith turned, shocked by the admission. Father Thomas raised a hand, stopping her. "Let me finish. I've been selfish, drowning my sorrows while you sacrificed your youth to care for me. It's not right." He met her gaze, his eyes clear and determined. "If this Zane fellow is decent, if he brings that smile to your face, then you shouldn't hide from it on my account." Tears pricked at Faith's eyes. In all the years since her mother's departure, this was the closest her father had come to acknowledging the burden she'd carried. "I'm not hiding," she said softly. Thomas's expression turned sad. "Aren't you? I've watched you shrink yourself, Faith. Avoid gatherings, decline invitations, work yourself to exhaustion. You've made yourself small to accommodate my weakness, and it stops now." Faith didn't know how to respond. Her father's words had cracked open something inside her, a recognition of truths she'd long denied. She had been hiding, not just from town gossip but from life itself, from the possibility of happiness and the risk of pain it carried. "There's a dance Saturday," she said, the words emerging before she'd fully decided to speak them. "Mr. Zane asked if I might attend with him." Thomas nodded slowly. "And will you?" Faith hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I believe I will." A ghost of a smile touched her father's lips. "Good. It's time you started living again, Faith. We both should." He rose from his chair, moving to the small cupboard where he kept his whiskey. For a moment, Faith's heart sank, thinking he would retreat into the bottle as he so often did. Instead, Thomas picked up the half-empty bottle, carried it to the door, and threw it into the yard with enough force that she heard it shatter against a rock. "First step's the hardest," he said, returning to his chair. "But I reckon it's past time I took it." Faith stared at him, hope and caution warring in her chest. She'd seen her father make similar gestures before, declarations of change that lasted days or sometimes weeks before the craving overwhelmed his resolve. Yet something felt different this time, a steadiness in his gaze, a certainty in his posture that had been absent for years. "We'll take it together," she said, crossing the room to place a hand on his shoulder. "One day at a time." Thomas covered her hand with his own, rough palm against her smooth skin. "One day at a time," he agreed. That night, as Faith lay in her narrow bed listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin settling, she allowed herself to fully contemplate Kieran's invitation. The prospect of entering the dance hall on his arm sent equal measures of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. People would talk, they always did. But perhaps Kieran was right. Perhaps living according to others' expectations meant letting them win, and Faith Miller was tired of losing. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers through Silver Creek. Faith moved through her morning duties at the Mercantile with uncharacteristic distraction, her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the evening ahead. "You're a million miles away today," Mr. Wilcox observed as she miscounted a customer's change for the third time. "Something on your mind?" Faith flushed, correcting her error. Just thinking about some mending I need to do, she lied. Wilcox chuckled, not fooled for a moment. Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain rancher who's been in here every day this week, would it? Man surely needs a lot of supplies for that place of his. Faith busied herself with straightening a display of canned goods. Mr. Zane is restoring an entire homestead. It requires many supplies. MMHMM, Wilcox hummed, clearly unconvinced. And I suppose those supplies always need to be purchased during your shift by pure coincidence. It was true that Kieran had appeared at the mercantile each day since their supper together. Sometimes he stayed only long enough to purchase small items and exchange pleasantries, other times lingering to discuss his progress on the ranch or ask Faith's opinion on local matters. Each visit left her feeling more comfortable in his presence, more drawn to his quiet strength and genuine interest in her thoughts. He's invited me to the dance tonight, Faith admitted, seeing no point in denying what would soon be common knowledge. Wilcox's bushy eyebrows shot up. Has he now? And are you going? Faith nodded, bracing herself for disapproval or warning. Instead, the old storekeeper smiled broadly. Good for you, he said, and good for him. Man's got taste. He studied her for a moment, then added, Why don't you head out early today, get yourself ready proper? Faith blinked in surprise. But the inventory can wait till Monday, Wilcox interrupted. Go on now. Consider it my contribution to your evening. Gratitude washed over Faith. Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. The storekeeper waved her away. Just make sure to save me a dance when these old bones can manage it again. Used to cut quite a figure on the dance floor, you know. Faith laughed, imagining the portly, dignified Mr. Wilcox twirling around the dance hall. I'll hold you to that. As she gathered her things to leave, Wilcox called after her, and Faith, wear that blue dress of yours. Brings out your eyes. The fact that the observant old man had noticed such a detail touched Faith deeply. Perhaps she'd been more visible all along than she'd believed, seen and valued by people like Wilcox, even as she tried to fade into the background. Faith walked home with a lighter step than usual, planning the evening ahead. The blue dress Wilcox mentioned was her best, a simple but well-made cotton frock with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She'd sewn it herself 2 Christmases ago, but had worn it only twice, having few occasions that warranted her finest clothes. At home, she found her father in the yard, splitting wood with more energy than she'd seen from him in months. He paused, leaning on the axe as she approached. You're home early, he observed, wiping sweat from his brow. Mr. Wilcox gave me the afternoon off, Faith explained. To prepare for the dance, Thomas nodded. Good man, Wilcox, he gestured toward the cabin. I've drawn you a bath. Water should still be hot. Faith stared at him in astonishment. Heating water for a bath was a laborious process, requiring multiple trips to the creek and considerable firewood. It was a luxury she rarely indulged in, especially midday. You didn't have to do that, she said, touched by the gesture. Thomas shrugged, a hint of his old smile emerging. Wanted to, go on now before it gets cold. The bath was indeed still warm, and Faith sank into it gratefully, allowing the heat to soothe muscles tense from anticipation. She washed her hair thoroughly, rinsing it with rosemary water she'd prepared the previous day. As she dried and dressed, she caught glimpses of herself in the small mirror hanging on her bedroom wall, cheeks flushed with excitement, eyes bright with anticipation. The blue dress fit as well as she remembered, the color deepening her eyes and complementing her chestnut hair, which she arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She had few adornments, a pearl button necklace that had been her grandmother's and a pair of small silver earrings, gifts from her father on her 16th birthday, before the worst of his decline. When she emerged from her room, Thomas looked up from his seat by the fire, his expression softening as he took in her appearance. You look beautiful, Faith, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Like your mother on our wedding day. Faith smiled, accepting the comparison as the compliment it was intended to be. Thank you, Father. Your young man coming to collect you? Thomas asked. Faith shook her head. We agreed to meet at the dance hall. It had seemed safer somehow, less formal than having Kieran call at her home. Thomas frowned slightly. Not proper, a young lady walking alone in the evening. It's barely sunset, Faith pointed out, and it's not far. Her father considered this, then rose from his chair. I'll walk you there. Faith was about to protest when she noticed his appearance freshly shaved, hair neatly combed, wearing his good shirt and the vest she'd mended last winter. He'd prepared for this, she realized. Had made an effort not just for her sake, but perhaps for his own as well. I'd like that, she said instead. They walked toward town in comfortable silence, the evening air cool against Faith's skin. As they approached the dance hall, she could hear the music already playing, see the warm light spilling from the windows. Couples and families streamed through the doors, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of community. Faith's steps slowed as they drew nearer, old insecurities resurfacing. What if Kieran had changed his mind? What if people stared or whispered? What if Faith? The sound of her name, spoken in that now familiar deep voice, cut through her spiraling thoughts. Kieran stood a few yards away, dressed in dark pants, a crisp white shirt, and a tailored vest. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and his eyes, those kind, perceptive eyes, were fixed on her with unmistakable admiration. You look beautiful, he said as he approached, then turned to Thomas with a respectful nod. Mr. Miller, I presume? Kieran Zane. Thomas assessed the younger man with a father's scrutiny. Heard you bought the Carson place. Yes, sir, Kieran confirmed. Been working to restore it these past weeks. Ambitious project, Thomas commented. Carson let those buildings go to ruin long before he left. True, Kieran agreed. But the bones are good, nothing that can't be fixed with hard work and the right materials. Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with this practical assessment. Faith tells me you're from Texas, born and raised, Kieran confirmed. Ranched there most of my life before deciding on a change of scenery. The two men continued their conversation, discussing the differences between Texas and Colorado ranching, while Faith watched in amazement. Her father was engaging socially in a way she hadn't seen in years, asking pertinent questions and offering his own knowledge of local conditions. Eventually, Thomas seemed to reach a decision. He extended his hand to Kieran, who shook it firmly. Take care of my daughter, Mr. Zane. She deserves a pleasant evening. That's my intention, sir, Kieran replied, his tone respectful but confident. Thomas turned to Faith, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. Enjoy yourself, he said softly. Don't worry about me. I've some business with Reverend Holloway tonight. Faith raised an eyebrow and Thomas chuckled. Nothing scandalous. The church needs some carpentry work and I'm offering my services. Figure it's time I put these hands to better use than holding a whiskey glass. Pride swelled in Faith's chest. I'll see you at home later. As Thomas walked away, Kieran offered Faith his arm. Shall we? Faith hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. Yes, she said, taking a deep breath. I believe we shall. Entering the dance hall on Kieran's arm felt like crossing an invisible threshold, not just into the warm, lamp-lit room, but into a new chapter of her life. Heads turned as they entered, conversations pausing briefly before resuming with renewed intensity. Faith felt the familiar weight of scrutiny pressing down on her, threatening to drive her back into the shadows. But then Kieran's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gentle reassurance that anchored her to the present moment. Ignore them, he murmured. They'll find something new to gossip about by tomorrow. The simple acknowledgement of the situation without dismissing her discomfort helped Faith straighten her shoulders and lift her chin. She was here, stepping into the light, and no amount of whispers could push her back into darkness. The dance hall was transformed from the glimpses Faith had stolen from outside golden lamplight, bathed the wooden floor, bunting and spring flowers decorated the walls, and a small group of musicians played lively tunes from a corner stage. Couples twirled across the floor while others gathered around the edges, chatting and refreshing themselves at a long table laden with punch and simple refreshments. "Would you like something to drink?" Kieran asked, guiding Faith toward a less crowded area. "Yes, please," she replied, grateful for the opportunity to collect herself. As Kieran moved toward the refreshment table, Faith found herself approached by Mrs. Jennings, the baker's wife, a plump, good-natured woman who frequented the mercantile. "Faith Miller, what a lovely surprise to see you here," Mrs. Jennings said, her tone warm and genuine. "And with Mr. Zane, he's caused quite a stir among the single ladies in town." Faith managed a smile, unsure how to respond to this implied compliment. "He's very kind," she offered, Mrs. Jennings patted her arm. "And handsome as the day is long. Good for you, dear. It's about time you joined in the fun instead of watching from the sidelines." Before Faith could respond, Kieran returned with 2 cups of punch. He nodded politely to Mrs. Jennings. "Evening, madam, Mr. Zane." "We were just talking about you," the older woman said with a twinkle in her eye. "You've chosen the perfect partner for the evening. Our Faith is the sweetest girl in Silver Creek, though she keeps it well hidden." Faith felt her cheeks warm at the praise, but Kieran merely smiled. "No argument from me on that score, Mrs. Jennings. I consider myself fortunate that Miss Miller agreed to accompany me tonight." Mrs. Jennings beamed at them both before being called away by her husband. As she departed, Faith took a sip of punch, using the moment to regain her composure. "She's right, you know," Kieran said, watching the dancers. "I am fortunate." Faith glanced at him, trying to determine if he was merely being polite. His expression, however, held nothing but sincerity. "You could have invited any woman in town," she said quietly. "Many would have been eager to accept." Kieran turned to her, his gaze direct. "I didn't want any woman in town, I wanted you." The simple declaration, spoken without pretense or flattery, left Faith momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, the music changed, shifting to a familiar waltz. "Would you honor me with a dance, Faith?" Kieran asked, setting aside his cup and extending his hand. This time there was no hesitation. Faith placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Unlike their first dance beneath the cottonwood, this one would be witnessed by the entire town. Yet as Kieran's hand settled at her waist and they began to move to the music, Faith found the stares and whispers fading into insignificance. There was only the music, the steady guidance of Kieran's lead, and the warmth in his eyes as he looked down at her. They moved together with surprising ease, as if they'd danced 100 times before. "You're a natural," Kieran said, echoing his words from their moonlit dance. Faith smiled. "I had a good teacher." "One dance hardly qualifies me as a teacher," he replied with a chuckle. "It was enough," Faith said softly. "You showed me I could do something I thought was beyond me. Sometimes that's all the teaching a person needs." Kieran's expression grew thoughtful. "Is that what you were afraid of, that you couldn't dance?" Faith shook her head slightly as they turned. "Not exactly. I was afraid of being seen, of stepping into a place where I didn't feel I belonged." "And now?" Kieran asked, his voice gentle. Faith considered the question as they continued to move across the floor. The initial discomfort of being observed had faded, replaced by the simple joy of dancing with a partner who made her feel valued and visible in the best possible way. "Now I'm beginning to think I was wrong," she admitted. "That perhaps I do belong if I allow myself to." Kieran's smile deepened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "That's a powerful realization." The waltz ended, transitioning to a livelier tune that had couples forming lines for a country dance. Faith expected Kieran might suggest they rest, but instead he kept hold of her hand. "Shall we continue?" he asked, eyes bright with enjoyment. Faith found herself laughing, a free and unguarded sound that surprised her with its spontaneity. "Yes, let's." They danced song after song, reels and polkas, another waltz and a Virginia reel that left Faith breathless and flushed with exertion. When they finally took a break, retreating to the edge of the room for refreshment, several people approached to greet them, including Mr. Wilcox, who beamed at Faith like a proud father. Told you that blue brings out your eyes, he said, patting her hand. You're the belle of the ball, my dear. Faith smiled at the exaggeration. Hardly that, Mr. Wilcox, but I am enjoying myself. As you should, the storekeeper replied before turning to Kieran. You're a lucky man, Zane, remember that. Every day, sir, Kieran replied with a respectful nod. As the evening progressed, Faith found herself increasingly at ease, accepting invitations to dance from other partners, Mr. Wilcox for a slow waltz that accommodated his rheumatism, young Timothy Roberts for an enthusiastic if somewhat clumsy reel, and even Reverend Holloway for a dignified promenade. Each time, her eyes sought out Kieran, finding him watching her with a mixture of admiration and patience. And each time, she returned to his side, drawn by the connection that had been building between them since that first night beneath the cottonwood. Having second thoughts about attending, Kieran asked during a quiet moment as they stood near an open window, catching the cool night breeze. Faith shook her head. No, just the opposite. She looked out at the star-filled sky. I'm wondering why I waited so long. Fear is a powerful deterrent, Kieran observed, especially fear of judgment. Yes, Faith agreed, but you were right. Their whispers reflect more about them than about me. She turned to him, gathering her courage. Thank you for helping me see that, for encouraging me to step into the light. Kieran's expression softened. You were ready. I just offered a hand. The music slowed again, the fiddle player drawing out a sweet, poignant melody that seemed to hang in the air like mist. Couples drew closer on the dance floor, moving in gentle circles. One more dance, Kieran asked, his voice low. Faith nodded, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. This time, he held her closer than before, still proper, but with an intimacy that spoke of growing comfort between them. Faith relaxed into his embrace, aware of the solid strength of his chest beneath her hand, the gentle pressure of his fingers at her waist. I'm leaving for Denver tomorrow, Kieran said as they turned slowly. Need to arrange for cattle to be brought up from Texas, some equipment too. Faith felt a pang of disappointment. How long will you be gone? A week, perhaps 2, he replied. Depends on how quickly the arrangements can be made. Faith nodded, trying to hide her reaction. 2 weeks suddenly seemed an eternity, which was foolish. They'd known each other barely a fortnight themselves. I'd like to call on you when I return, Kieran continued. Properly. With your father's permission. Faith's steps faltered slightly before she recovered. Call on me, Kieran's hand tightened briefly at her waist. Yes, if that would be agreeable to you. The implications of his request weren't lost on Faith. Calling officially with her father's blessing suggested intentions beyond casual friendship. It was a step toward courtship, toward possibilities she'd scarcely allowed herself to consider. That would be agreeable, she said softly, her heart quickening. Kieran's smile was warm enough to chase away the evening chill. Good. That's very good. The dance continued, but something had shifted between them, a spoken acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since their first encounter. Faith felt both terrified and exhilarated, like standing at the edge of a vast, unknown territory with only Kieran's hand to guide her forward. As the music drew to a close, Kieran led her toward the door. May I walk you home? He asked. Faith nodded, suddenly eager for the quiet of the night and the opportunity to process all that had transpired. They said their goodbyes to various acquaintances, accepting good-natured teasing and warm wishes with equal grace. Outside, the spring night had turned cool, stars brilliant in the clear sky above Silver Creek. Kieran removed his jacket, draping it over Faith's shoulders despite her protestations. I'm perfectly warm, he insisted. Texas blood runs hot. The walk to the Miller cabin took them along the main street, past darkened storefronts and the still-lit windows of the saloon, then onto the quieter path that led to the outskirts of town. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager to end the evening. Did you enjoy yourself? Kieran asked, his arm brushing against hers as they walked. More than I expected to, Faith admitted. It was liberating in a way to be part of things instead of watching from the outside. Kieran nodded. Sometimes the hardest step is the first one. Everything after that gets easier. Is that what it was like for you? Faith asked. After your wife died, taking that first step forward, Kieran was quiet for a moment, his pace slowing. In some ways, he finally said, though there were many first steps, first day without her, first meal alone. First time I laughed and didn't immediately feel guilty for it. He glanced at Faith. Coming to Colorado was another first step, meeting you was yet another. The implication that meeting her had been a significant moment in his journey from grief touched Faith deeply. I'm glad you found me in the shadows that night, she said softly. So am I, Kieran replied. Though I think you would have found your way into the light eventually, with or without me. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Faith Miller. They had reached the cabin, a single lamp burning in the window indicating that Thomas was still awake. Faith turned to Kieran, removing his jacket and handing it back with reluctance. Thank you for tonight, she said. For everything. Kieran took the jacket, his fingers brushing against hers. May I write to you while I'm in Denver? Faith nodded, warmth spreading through her at the thought of receiving his letters. I'd like that very much. They stood for a moment in the quiet darkness, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Kieran took her hand, raising it slowly to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Faith, he said, his voice low and warm. Dream sweetly. Faith felt the imprint of his lips on her skin like a promise. Safe travels, she replied, and hurry back. She watched as he walked away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Only when he was out of sight did Faith turn toward the cabin, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Inside, her father looked up from his chair by the fire, a book open on his lap instead of the usual whiskey bottle. Had a good time? He asked. Faith smiled, removing her shawl and hanging it by the door. Yes, very much so, Thomas nodded, studying her face. You're glowing, girl. Reminds me of Mother, Faith finished for him. You said that earlier. Did I? Thomas seemed surprised. Well, it's true, she had that same look when she was happy, like sunshine from the inside out. He closed his book. Your Mr. Zane seems a decent sort. He's going to Denver tomorrow, Faith said, sitting in the chair opposite her father. Business for his ranch. He asked if he might call on me when he returns. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Call on you proper, you mean, with intentions? Faith nodded, suddenly shy, if that's acceptable to you. Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he looked up, his eyes were clear and direct. He make you happy, Faith? I think he could, she answered honestly. Given time. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he's welcome here. But I'll be having a serious conversation with him first. Man to man. Faith smiled, touched by this protective gesture. I would expect nothing less. Good, Thomas said, rising from his chair. Now get some rest, you've had quite an evening. As Faith prepared for bed, removing the pearl button necklace and carefully hanging her blue dress, she replayed the events of the night in her mind, the dances, the conversations, the moment Kieran had asked to court her properly. Each memory glowed like a candle flame, illuminating corners of her heart that had been dark for too long, for years. Faith had defined herself by her losses and limitations, her mother's abandonment, her father's decline, the town's judgment. Tonight, for the first time, she'd glimpsed a different possibility. A life defined not by what she lacked, but by what she might gain. Not by where she'd been, but by where she might go. As she drifted towards sleep, Faith's thoughts turned to Kieran, his steady presence, his perceptive kindness, the way he seemed to see past her carefully constructed walls to the woman beneath. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she was no longer afraid to find out. The woman who had stood alone in the shadows of a dance was stepping into the light, one brave footfall at a time. And that, Faith decided as sleep claimed her, was progress worth celebrating. The following 2 weeks passed both more quickly and more slowly than Faith had anticipated. Her days fell into a familiar rhythm: work at the mercantile, household duties, caring for her father, but each was brightened by the arrival of Kieran's letters, delivered by the stage that connected Silver Creek to larger towns. His first letter arrived 3 days after his departure, a thick envelope addressed in a strong, slanting hand. Faith had waited until evening to open it, savoring the anticipation as she completed her chores. In the privacy of her room, she broke the seal and unfolded several pages covered in neat, masculine script. Kieran wrote vividly of his journey to Denver, the people he'd encountered, the business arrangements he was making for his ranch. But more meaningful to Faith were the personal reflections scattered throughout memories that reminded him of her, questions about her day, hopes for their future conversations. "I find myself thinking of you at unexpected moments," he wrote near the end. The sight of a blue dress in a shop window, the sound of a woman's laughter that briefly resembles yours. Denver is full of people and activity, yet I find myself eager to return to the quiet of Silver Creek and to you. Faith read and reread his letters, composing careful replies that gradually grew more personal and open as her confidence increased. She shared stories of her childhood before her mother left, described her dreams of someday traveling beyond Colorado, confessed her growing hope that her father's sobriety might last this time. Through this correspondence, a deeper connection formed between them, one built on shared thoughts and feelings rather than physical presence. By the time Kieran's final letter arrived, announcing his return in 2 days' time, Faith felt as if she'd known him for years rather than weeks. Silver Creek had noticed the change in Faith. She walked taller now, met people's eyes, even engaged in conversations beyond the necessary exchanges of business. Mrs. Jennings commented on it one morning as Faith selected bread at the bakery. "Love agrees with you, my dear," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "You've bloomed like a flower after rain." Faith blushed but didn't deny the observation. "Mr. Zane returns tomorrow," she said instead. Mrs. Jennings patted her hand. "The whole town's noticed your correspondence. Postmaster Jenkins says he's never seen such regular letters between two people who aren't even engaged yet." The yet hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Faith merely smiled, neither confirming nor denying the possibility. At home, more changes had taken root. Thomas Miller remained sober, attending church for the first time in years, and securing regular carpentry work, repairing the church pews and building shelves for the school. Faith sometimes caught him looking at her with a mixture of pride and regret, as if seeing both the woman she'd become and the girl whose childhood he'd partially stolen through his neglect. On the eve of Kieran's return, Thomas surprised Faith by bringing home a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Faith asked as he placed it on the table before her. "Open it and see," Thomas replied, an unusual nervousness in his demeanor. Faith carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, exquisitely carved with a pattern of wildflowers. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, admiring the craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" she asked, opening the hinged lid to find the interior lined with soft fabric. Thomas nodded. "Been working on it evenings at the church. Thought you might need somewhere special to keep those letters of yours." Tears pricked at Faith's eyes. The gift represented more than just a box. It was an acknowledgement of her growing relationship with Kieran, a blessing from her father, and a demonstration of his returning skills. "It's beautiful," she said, rising to embrace him. "Thank you." Thomas returned the embrace awkwardly, still unaccustomed to such displays after years of emotional distance. "You deserve beautiful things, Faith," he said gruffly. "Always have." That night, Faith carefully placed Kieran's letters in the box, running her fingers over the carved flowers one last time before closing the lid. Tomorrow he would return, and their correspondence would give way to in-person conversations. The thought both excited and frightened her. What if the connection they'd built through letters didn't translate to real life? What if he found her less interesting in person than on paper? She pushed these worries aside as she prepared for bed. Whatever tomorrow brought, Faith was no longer the woman who hid in shadows. She would face it and Kieran in the full light of day with an open heart and newfound courage. Kieran arrived in Silver Creek on the afternoon stage, dust-covered and weary from travel, but with a smile that brightened his entire face when he spotted Faith waiting near the mercantile. She had positioned herself there deliberately, wanting to see him first but reluctant to appear too eager by waiting directly at the stage stop. He approached her with long strides, removing his hat as he drew near. "Miss Miller," he greeted her, his voice warm with unspoken emotion. "Mr. Zane," Faith replied, struggling to maintain proper decorum when all she wanted was to throw propriety aside and embrace him. "Welcome back to Silver Creek." "It's good to be back," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Denver has its charms, but I found myself missing the quieter pleasures of our little town." The hour wasn't lost on Faith, a small word that suggested belonging, connection, shared experience. "I trust your business was successful?" Kieran nodded. "Very much so. I've arranged for a herd to be driven up from Texas, not large, but quality stock to start my breeding program. Should arrive within the month, along with some equipment and supplies." He glanced around, noting the curious onlookers pretending not to observe their reunion. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere less public," Faith gestured toward the mercantile. "Mr. Wilcox gave me the afternoon off. We could sit on the bench behind the store. It's quiet there." Kieran offered his arm, which Faith took with only the slightest hesitation. As they walked, he asked about her father, the town, any news she hadn't included in her letters. Faith answered, noting how much more natural their conversation felt after weeks of written exchange. The bench behind Wilcox's store overlooked a small garden the storekeeper maintained, now blooming with early summer flowers. They sat with a proper distance between them, though Faith was acutely aware of every inch of that space. "Your letters kept me company on some long evenings," Kieran said after they'd settled. "I found myself looking forward to them more than any other part of my day." Faith smiled, pleased by the admission. "As did I. Though I fear my life in Silver Creek provided less interesting material than your adventures in Denver." "On the contrary," Kieran replied. "Your descriptions of everyday life here, your thoughts and observations, they reminded me of what matters, of why I left Texas in the first place." "And why was that?" Faith asked. "Beyond what you've already told me, I mean." Kieran was quiet for a moment, seemed to gather his thoughts. "After Alina died, I kept the ranch running because it was what everyone expected. Her family, my family, the hands who depended on me for their livelihood. I went through the motions, did what needed doing, but my heart wasn't in it." He looked at Faith. "I came to Colorado to find out if I could still feel passion for the work, for life itself. To discover if there was more to me than grief and obligation." "And have you?" Faith asked softly. "Found those answers?" Kieran's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I'm beginning to. The ranch feels right, a challenge worth pursuing. And there are other discoveries I've made that give me hope for the future." The implication hung between them, clear but unspoken. Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks but didn't look away. "I'm glad," she said simply. "Faith," Kieran began, then paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I meant what I wrote in my letters. These past weeks have only confirmed what I began to suspect that first night we danced. There's something rare between us, a connection I wasn't sure I'd ever find again." Faith's heart quickened. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "With your permission and your father's, I'd like to call on you officially," Kieran continued, "to court you properly with honorable intentions." Though she'd anticipated this request, hearing it spoken aloud made it wonderfully, terrifyingly real. Faith took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I would like that very much," she replied, "and I believe my father would welcome your call." The smile that spread across Kieran's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. "Tomorrow afternoon. I need to check on the ranch first, make sure nothing's fallen apart in my absence." Faith nodded. "Tomorrow would be perfect. Father will be home from church repairs by 4. As they rose to leave their secluded spot, Kieran reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "Thank you, Faith," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for seeing past the stranger who interrupted your solitude that night, for giving me a chance to know you." Faith looked up at him, no longer afraid to let him see the emotion in her eyes. "Thank you for finding me in the shadows," she replied, "and for being patient while I found my way to the light." For a moment, Faith thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and he seemed to sway slightly forward. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that somehow felt more intimate than a conventional kiss might have. "Until tomorrow," he said, releasing her hand reluctantly. Faith watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from his touch. The woman who had once hidden in shadows now stood proudly in the sunlight, heart open to possibilities she'd never dared imagine. And somewhere in the vast, unknowable future, a dance awaited them, not beneath a cottonwood tree or in a crowded hall, but across the landscape of a shared life, moving together in the light they'd found in each other's eyes.